Hi, everyone. Um, like I mentioned, obviously this week we will be virtual just because on Thursday is Cesar Chavez Day, and I figured that it'd be easier just to record my lecture that I was going to do this week online and go from there. Um, so what I want to talk about today is Chapter 8, which is essentially the first 20 or so odd years of this new American Republic under the Constitution and how this experiment works and doesn't. As we'll see over the next 20, 25 years, there are successes, there are failures, um, but at the end, you do begin to see this American experiment, as it's called, really kind of begin to prosper. But let's start from the very beginning. Um, if you'll recall, obviously needs to say the first president in American history is George Washington. And although there's nothing in the Constitution about this, he decided to create a group of advisors, someone who can advise him in terms of various areas of expertise like war and finances and things of this nature. And so, excuse me, um, so he essentially creates what is known as the cabinet, and it's still a entity that still exists to this day. There's secretaries of education, secretaries of state, et cetera, et cetera. Now, originally, there's only about five members of the cabinet. Now it's somewhere in the 20s. There's different things like now, but they've added over the last 200 or so odd years. But the one I want to focus on right now is that of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, and Alexander Hamilton is a individual who not only believes that a strong centralized authority is what exactly the United States needs. He also believes in a future where the United States becomes industrialized. That it kind of moves away from the agrarian society that it has become and focuses on industry, particularly that of textiles. And so we'll see both of these ideas of a strong central authority and an industrialized society kind of come out in his vision. So Alexander Hamilton, when he becomes Secretary of Treasury, uh, essentially adopts a huge set of problems. If y'all recall, the United States, when it became independent, was pretty much bankrupt. Didn't have any money, and its economy was kind of in shambles. And so all of a sudden now, it is his responsibility to essentially not only figure out a way to pay off the United States, various debts, and it has quite a bit, but in addition, also kind of prove to the world that the United States, can function, especially when it comes to taking out loans. Most countries at this point in time, if not all of them, particularly in Europe, operate through a series of loans and extensions, et cetera, et cetera. As we'll talk about just a little bit, France right now is doing it at a very dangerous level. And so acquiring debt and using that debt as proof that you are a stable society is one that is actually pretty common. But let's talk about his plans. First of all, the big plan that he had, or the big kind of step that he had in terms of the economic stabilization of the United States, is the assuming of state debts. Now, I think I mentioned this in class very briefly. The states found themselves in tremendous amount of debt because of the war and had struggled to pay them off. And Alexander Hamilton believed that the best course of action for both the states and for this new federal government is for the federal government to assume the states' debts. Now, the states, you would think that they'd be happy to pass off their debt. But remember, this is still at a time when states were kind of weary, and many people as well were kind of weary about, basically handing over authority to a central government. Again, this fear of tyranny or an overburdening government. So many states were still very much hesitant to actually do this, especially that in the South. The next thing is the reorganization of the national debt. And this is kind of the same type of situation we were talking about earlier, where, again, the idea of eliminating debt from a nation in its entirety is one that it's not only very difficult to do, it's not a good idea. Um, just like today, and today, people, whatever, whether it's to buy a car or to buy a home, etc., the first thing that banks and other financiers look at is a credit score. And the credit score determines and your credit history determines a lot about your ability to purchase things. And more anything else, what they are looking for is proof that you pay off debt. Not that necessarily you acquire too much. Yes, there is a problem with that, but they want to know that you can acquire debt and pay it off in a timely manner. And so, in many instances, many financiers at the time that we're talking about here want to see the United States be able to pay off its debt, right, in a timely fashion. Not necessarily to pay off it entirely, all right, but at the same time make reasonable payments on debt so that you establish some sense of credit, so that banks can trust you. In this case, trust the United States to loan them money and feel confident that they're going to get paid back eventually. All right, and so this is what this is all about. Really, is assuring banks and foreign governments, et cetera, that the United States pays off its debts. All right, again, very few people at this point in time are recognizing the idea of paying off debt completely. That's not very feasible. It's not a good idea. You want to keep some form of debt to prove, in order to pay it off, slowly but surely. But nonetheless, Alexander Hamilton wants to reorganize both the federal and the state debts and ensure that they're paid off in a timely manner to convince creditors that the United States is a functional government. Obviously, in order to pay off this debt, you need revenue. You need money coming in. And so you also have the creation of an effective tax system and also the creation of industrial tariffs and subsidies. Now, remember, these tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So Alexander Hamilton is hoping to encourage the growth of American businesses and industries here. And so he believes the best way to do this is to essentially raise tariffs on imported goods. So let's say, for example, something as simple as a shirt. All right. If usually you can get it from England for relatively cheap because they produce a lot of textiles, but what you begin to see happening are tariffs on products like shirts. So the hopes that the price of the shirt now with that tax imposed will convince American consumers to buy American. All right. So instead of buying a British shirt, all right, the raised price because of the tariff will convince individuals to buy or convince Americans to buy a locally made shirt. All right. In addition, you also have the creation of subsidies. Again, these are subsidies. These are basically money that the government gives to allow businesses to kind of prosper in those first few years. All right. So again, clearly Alexander Hamilton is trying to create an environment that is safe for American industries and allow them to grow. Now, the last bit, and probably the most controversial of these, is the creation of the Bank of the United States. At the time, there is no centralized form of banking. When the United States was created under the Constitution. As a matter of fact, there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about a centralized bank. Um, and so he believed that by creating a national bank, not only do you have the ability to basically allow the United States government to loan money to itself, but also you also have it set up to loan out money to Americans. If you want to start a business, if you want to buy land, et cetera, the Bank of the United States can provide low interest loans for these individuals. All right. And not only that, create a national system of currency. At this point in time, the American currency system is kind of not good. And what I mean by that is that you have local banks just issuing money on their own. All right. And even some states do that, but there is no centralized government. So let's say that you move from Virginia to New York, your money may not be good unless you have actual hard currency in the form of gold or silver. So a national currency is also one of the big benefits of that. So again, creating a national bank in which the United States again is able to loan money to itself, to its people, and also to create a national currency system is what really Alexander Hamilton has in mind. Now, this last point here about the about the national bank is one that is incredibly controversial, especially when it comes to powerful individuals like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Now, remember, these two individuals very, very involved in the creation of the American Constitution. They see the creation of a bank in the United States as unconstitutional, right? Strictly because, or mostly because, you don't have anything in the Constitution regarding that. So they believe if it's not written in the Constitution, it should be considered unconstitutional. Now, it's kind of funny that Alexander Hamilton is a big opponent of this concept of strict of loose, what we call loose interpretation. I'll explain what that means in just a bit, because, and keep that in mind, because his opinion is that if it's not in the Constitution, it should be unconstitutional. This will become very important later on, over the next couple of about 10 or 15 years later. Now, um, eventually, so you have this kind of showdown between Jefferson and Hamilton, who again have two very different opinions of what about the future of not just the federal government but the United States, and so all of a sudden it becomes an issue, and so this begins this kind of interpretation of the Constitution. Right, and this is what is referred to as strict and loose construction or interpretation. In other words, strict interpretists or strict constructionists believe that the letter of the Constitution is what's in the Constitution. So again, if it's not in there specifically written, it is unconstitutional. Now, loose constructionists or loose interpretationalists believe that if it's not explicitly prohibited, it's not unconstitutional. So in this case, Alexander Hamilton takes the loose construction interpretation and believes that because the Bank of the United States is not explicitly forbidden, it's constitutional. Now, eventually, however, Alexander Hamilton's idea of a national bank would win out, mostly because it gains the support of the president George Washington. George Washington kind of at first is kind of hesitant, but he believes that this is what's best for the United States, and so he kind of throws his support behind the Bank of the United States and is created. Now, the other issue is that of the state debts. Now, as I mentioned, the biggest opponents of this acquisition of state debt are the southern states. Southern states really have a hard time letting go, or just, still weary of this whole federal encroachment. And so eventually a deal is struck between, the supporters of Hamilton, the supporters of Jefferson, on a compromise. The compromise being that the federal government would assume the debts of the southern states on the condition that the national capital, which is again still being debated, be moved into the southern states. Now, at the time, the national capital was based out of New York City. However, there had been discussions about, possibly moving the national capital to somewhere more of a centralized location. In this case, right, the federal government agreed to build a new capital on the banks of the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia, which is technically in the southern states. So this is the compromise that was created again as a deal. The deal was that the federal government would assume the debts, the Revolutionary War debts of the states, on the condition that the national capital would be moved, all right, where now present-day Washington, D.C. is located. Now, needless to say, there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's already pretty complicated, but things get even more complicated in 1789. So, if y'all recall, the French decided to join the side of the Americans in their War of Independence against the British, and their help was kind of needed in order for the Americans to win this war. The problem, however, is that the French government found itself bankrupt after this war. So here's the thing: is that for the last 150 years, the French have pretty much been financially reckless. They have, while they are considered to be preeminent power in Europe, they're kind of the world superpower at this point, them and Great Britain. But the French have been financially responsible. Everything from lavish construction projects by the monarchs to, a very ancient and inefficient tax system. It's a finance, and even then taking out what are basically high interest loans, and basically taking out not only taking out high interest loans, but taking out other high interest loans to pay off those high interest loans. So it's really a mess. And so eventually, again, to their credit, the French finance ministers were able to kind of maneuver and kind of move things around. But by 1789, it becomes very clear that the financial situation in France is huge. It's really, really problematic. And so the French king basically calls for reorganization of government, and there had been already a lot of grievances by the French people against what is known as the Ancien Regime, the old a kingdom. And so eventually, these grievances turn into actual violence. And I'm really, I just want to let y'all know I'm really simplifying, oversimplifying the French Revolution, because I can talk about it for an entire semester, quite frankly, as an own lecture. So me kind of simplifying this is it's not doing it justice, but unfortunately, I'm short on time. So again, the French Revolution kind of begins out of this financial crisis and eventually breaks out into what is basically a revolution, where the non noble classes, the what we call the proletariat of French society, the just the average commoners, overthrow the French monarchy and establish what is originally a republic. Now, the other nations of Europe around them obviously become very nervous, especially when in 91, the king eventually is put on trial for treason and beheaded. And so eventually a war breaks out between France and Austria, in which most of Europe, including Britain, uh, uh, joins in a war together against the French. And so, again, by 1791, most of Europe is at war. And needless to say, this has ramifications everywhere. All right, again, this is a major deal. And so all of a sudden now the Americans are finding themselves taking one side or another. Individuals like, say, for example, uh, Thomas Jefferson was in favor of what was going on in France, but then you have Washington and Hamilton favoring that of Britain. Now, even though George Washington himself was, excuse me, took the side of the British personally, he emphasized that the United States would remain neutral throughout this war. All right, so he emphasized that the United States would not take sides, would remain neutral, and would conduct business with both. Now, eventually, 1794, the Jay's Treaty is signed between the United States and Britain, try to kind of put the old differences aside. Now, even though the Treaty of Paris, if y'all remember from 1783, ended the war, there's still a lot of uncertainty and still a lot of questions being brought up between the relationship between the Americans and the British. And Jay's Treaty, again, created in 1794 or negotiated in 1794, essentially tries to kind of resolve a lot of these issues, especially when it comes to commerce and trade. And so, um, eventually, needless to say, this kind of upsets. And so, with this kind of what's the word I'm looking for? These friendly relationships between Britain and the United States really does anger the French. If you all recall, the French and the Americans are still technically allies, and so all of a sudden now the Americans are doing business with France's enemy, and so this pretty much causes the French, what we call the Franco-American alliance, to collapse. Right, and so you begin to see the ramifications of the United States' actions happening kind of in real time, where all of a sudden now the United States kind of inches closer to Britain, resulting in a kind of a crisis with France, which will only get kind of weirder. Now, in 1794, another crisis breaks out back here at home. So, as I mentioned before, Alexander Hamilton has spent the last few years essentially creating a tax system. And one of the taxes he imposes is an excise tax on whiskey, basically what we call today a liquor tax. More than anything else, this affects the farmers of the western areas. These areas that are growing a lot of wheat, particularly, or growing a lot of rye, rye being used as the main ingredient for whiskey, all of a sudden find themselves, taxed. It's not an unreasonable tax, but one that they believe is unfair. And so eventually, the farmers of Western Pennsylvania specifically begin the process of actually protesting these new taxes. And eventually, this results in an actual rebellion, right, where the Western farmers begin seizing federal buildings in that particular part of the country. Now, if you'll recall, the last time that there was a major insurrection, what we call Shays Rebellion, the American government was powerless to actually stop this rebellion. However, this new government under the United States Constitution does have the power to defend itself, does have the power to raise an army, which is exactly what happened. The United States raises 15,000 men. George Washington leads them into Western Pennsylvania, and eventually the rebellion is put down. And so this is a relatively short and brief crisis, but nonetheless, there is a stark contrast between what happened in Shays Rebellion, if you'll recall, and what is happening here. Now, eventually, this you begin to see kind of this differentiation between groups of people coming together with similar views, and eventually these like-minded peoples begin forming societies, clubs, and while they don't know it at the time, this will create what is known today as the two-party system. Today the Democrats and Republicans kind of dominate American politics, and pretty much that's pretty much it. And the tradition of this two-party system has its origins here in this debate between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Now, if you could see here, you have two separate parties. Those are the Federalists, who are led by Alexander Hamilton, who appeal to the merchants, the wealthy, the educated, the city folk. Again, loose construction of the Constitution, aka implied powers. In other words, if it's not explicitly outlawed within the Constitution, it is implied that it's allowed. You have the creation of tax system, a national bank, the creation of a new national debt, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the Democratic Republicans, who are relatively on the other side, who are favored by the farmers and the South and the West. You also have the strict construction of the Constitution, support the French in their war against, well, Europe, and again, really not. They do believe in elimination of of national debt, but they want it completely eliminated, no debt whatsoever, and also, needless to say, in favor of reducing or eliminating taxes outright. So you see these two different, entities kind of forming at this early point in time. Now, the with the proliferation of the First Amendment. Now, if you already remember, the First Amendment, aside from the freedom of religion or freedom of expression, is also the freedom of the press. And so newspapers and magazines all of a sudden become numerous, where you have, printing presses being established in even small towns and villages. And also now you have these newspapers churning out magazines and newspapers, and even then you begin to see certain newspapers favored by the Federalists and others favored by the Democratic Republicans. You begin to see clubs forming, and so you all of a sudden you see this expansion of the public sphere in terms of politics, where more and more people are getting involved and at least being knowledgeable in what is going on in the political situation in the United States. Now, as I mentioned before, the expansion of the public sphere offered women an opportunity to take part in political discussions, read newspapers, and hear orations. So remember, many women were disappointed at the fact that the American Revolution resulted in very little in terms of their own rights and freedoms. Remember, many of them were hopeful that all of a sudden now they would be, even allowed to manage property or to file for divorce, or even in this case, or even, some actually advocated for women to receive the right to vote. But nonetheless, they found themselves to be disappointed. Nevertheless, you do see, women becoming involved in the public sphere, despite the fact that they cannot vote. They nonetheless, are open to express their opinions. The freedom of expression does not prohibit women from, doing that. An example of this is Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of Rights and Women. Now, this is a short, brief book talking about the need for women to have equal rights. The belief that, if you'll recall, the Americans, during the Revolution kind of promoted this idea of Republican womanhood, this idea that women should be partners with their husbands in terms of raising their children and espousing Republican beliefs. And Mary Wollstonecraft gives a very good point about, well, if you want women to be partners, then that assumes and implies that they should be equal, that, they should be just as educated as their husbands. So you have this very, this very sound argument, and the entire book is filled with these pretty rational and reasonable, or demands for rights. Sarah W. Morton, considered to be one of the preeminent poets of this time, again, used her poetry to espouse, what she senses injustices not only against women but against slaves. All right, again, an early poet, spent most of her or much of her work on the issue of women and of slaves. Now, in 1795, George Washington declines to run for a third term. Now, he had been president for the last 8 years, but believes that enough, and he voluntarily declined to run for a third term in office, despite overwhelming popularity. Now, before he leaves office officially, he gives an address to the American public. And this farewell address is actually kind of a warning in many ways, where he believes that the United States should do its best to avoid any type of foreign engagement. In other words, stay out of the wars going on in Europe and stay out of the wars going on anywhere else in the world. That doesn't concern us. And number two, he sensed the danger of this kind of growing rivalry between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and believed that this political party system, which is counterproductive and dangerous. And so it's kind of ironic that he kind of warns against this creation of this two-party system, and also the wars against foreign intervention, which really mark American history, all right, from this point on. So it's kind of a warning that was ignored in many ways. Nevertheless, in 1796, there was a new election. Now, here's the thing: is that the way that elections work up until this point in time, and it will change in about 4 years later, but the way elections work is that whenever a candidate runs for president, all the candidates run for president, the person who receives the most electoral votes becomes president, but the person who receives the second most electoral votes becomes vice president. So in this case, John Adams, if you all recall, the last time I talked about John Adams, he was a lawyer in Boston who represented those soldiers who shot into the crowd during the Boston Massacre. Well, now he is president of the United States, and his chief rival, Thomas Jefferson, is now vice president. Now, if you recall, well, something I should usually keep in mind that John Adams is very good friends with Alexander Hamilton. And so all of a sudden now there is this kind of awkwardness where, John Adams doesn't really care for Thomas Jefferson, respects him, but doesn't really care for his politics, is now his vice president. Now, during this period in time, you have, a couple of crises during Thomas Jefferson's, John Adams's presidency, which really caused a lot of controversy and will really kind of sink his popularity. The first one is the issue of the XYZ affair. Now, what this means is that, or what this XYZ affair is that American diplomats had been sent to France in July 1797 to essentially negotiate a solution to growing problems with the French. Now, the French had begun actually seizing American merchant vessels traveling to Europe. All right. Again, the idea is that the French were essentially blocking supplies getting to Britain during the war, and so the French were just seizing American vessels and just seizing goods and products and not reimbursing the Americans. All right, and so you begin to see tensions between the French and the Americans becoming more and more problematic, and so the the American diplomats were sent to Paris to essentially travel to see if they could talk to the French government about, resolving this diplomatically speaking, a peaceful negotiation, a peaceful end to what's going on. Now, eventually, these diplomats were eventually approached by three French agents who, in American documents, were only known as XYZ. Now, we know their names at the time, and I'm not going to make you remember them, but they're known as XYZ in early, I guess what you would call classified documents. And these French agents, X, Y, and Z, told the American diplomats that if you want to even meet with the leaders of the French, this new revolutionary French government, you're going to have to basically pay them a bribe. Now, something around the area of to about $200,000. And if you actually want a treaty, it's going to cost you a loan of $2.5 million. Again, clearly an open and blatant attempt to bribe Americans. Now, the way that this process of taking accepting bribes for political favors is something that is actually quite common in, I guess, what you would call Mediterranean cultures, France, Italy, Spain, and to extension Latin America. But in Northern European countries, this is simply just taboo. The collection of bribes or things like this is just simply not done. And so when word got back to the American public about what had happened during this meeting, they obviously, needless to say, were incredibly furious. And many, even those Americans who supported the French, essentially basically abandoned their support of the French. And so all of a sudden, this crisis leads to what is basically an undeclared war between the French and the Americans, where the Americans simply decide the only way that we can actually, kind of stop the French from seizing their vessels is just to basically fight fire with fire. And so the United States begins sending out its small but well trained navy out into the open seas and actually engaging with French vessels. Now, war was never officially declared between France and the United States, but nonetheless, it does, it is an undeclared war. It is a conflict. And so all of a sudden now you have this undeclared war, this what we call quasi war between the French and the United States, becoming more and more problematic. Now, in 1798, another tax rebellion breaks out, this time in what is the area of southeastern Pennsylvania. Now, southeastern Pennsylvania at this point in time is mostly inhabited by descendants of Dutch immigrants. Immigrants from Holland had settled here. They had been living here for the past, 150 years, what have you. And eventually they begin protesting essentially a new system of taxes to basically pay for the Navy fighting the Quasi-War. So Freeze Rebellion, which breaks out between 1799 and 1800, eventually, again, you have the small tax protests eventually leading into an actual rebellion. Now, again, much like the Whiskey Rebellion before, it was quickly put down. The leaders were arrested. Some of the members were charged with treason, but eventually were pardoned. And so, it does what at the end of the day, what it actually does do is essentially it does actually look bad for John Adams because in the opinion of many Americans, especially those of German or Dutch descent, this was actually an overreaction by the American government. In other words, that this rebellion, by the way, it's called the Freeze Rebellion because the so-called leader of this rebellion, a man named Jacob Freeze, was the leader, was not really a rebellion, but rather a protest that kind of got out of hand, and the Americans cracked down on it. And the United States Army actually cracked down on it pretty harshly. And so the result of this is actually negative for John Adams because not only does it seem like he's overreacting, it loses support among German Americans and Dutch Americans for the Federalist Party. Now, eventually, the protests against this undeclared war with the French, all of a sudden now you begin to see many Americans speaking out in protest of this war and protest on how Thomas Jefferson is handling it. And in response to this, the Congress, which is Federalist controlled, and needless to say, it's supportive of John Adams, signs what is known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, what these are a series of laws. The first one, the Alien Act, basically gives the executive, in other words, the President of the United States, the power to basically determine or to kick non-citizens out of the country. In this case, there had been a large number of French immigrants who had arrived in the United States and had been kind of, speaking out against the American pro-British stance. And so the Alien Act was designed to basically allow the president of the United States to basically kick out these French immigrants. Right. And the other thing is the Sedition Act. Now, the Sedition Act essentially prohibits any type of negative or any type of negative comment or speech or writings against the United States government, what it's doing in France, or what's doing, how it's treating France, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically a way to silence any type of opposition. And this is kind of symbolic of what happens for much of American history from this point in time. This issue of constitutionality, this issue of stability over freedom, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of a sudden, these two acts are incredibly controversial, as they should be. Now, while many states protest, you actually have two, the Virginia Kentucky resolutions. You actually have these two states, Virginia and Kentucky, actually telling the American government that they would not enforce these, that they would not arrest their citizens, based on these what they consider to be unconstitutional acts. And eventually, so all of a sudden now you have this kind of showdown between Kentucky and Virginia and the federal government. Now, eventually it was resolved, but what I want to point out is that um, this is kind of the beginning of a ongoing, let's call it, debate, ongoing, a political idea that can the states actually choose not to comply with laws it doesn't agree with? Um, the term that is actually used for this is nullification. Can the states nullify federal laws they don't agree with? And this will be a continuous question, debate for the rest of this class. Because at the end of the day, this is what really does kind of drive America into what eventually becomes a civil war, right? Especially, obviously when it comes to the issue of slavery. And so you see early on in American history, this issue of constitutionality and nullification becoming kind of brought up to the forefront. Now, um, so the eventually, obviously the Adams presidency filled with controversy, filled with, just these bad publicity, for lack of a better phrase. And eventually you have another election. In this case, Thomas Jefferson once again John Adams runs again for re-election, as does Thomas Jefferson. Now, kind of adding another wrinkle to this kind of already contentious relationship was that of Aaron Burr, another Federalist, also throws himself in the contention as well. Now, eventually, the result of this election is that Aaron Burr is a, kind of an ally of Jefferson, but at the same time has some Federalist ideas. Now, eventually, John Adams for sure loses this election. John Adams doesn't receive enough votes, and basically, he is the first one-term president. However, you also find yourself in a constitutional crisis because Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson both receive 73 electoral votes. It's a tie. And so the Constitution does have something about this, and eventually the election has to go to the House. Now, the House at the time is run or controlled by the Federalists. And needless to say, quite frankly, they don't care for either of these individuals. They don't really care for um, they don't really care for Jefferson, and they don't care for Burr. However, Jefferson is able to convince the Federalists essentially that, a lot of the Federalist positions, especially when it comes to the concept of the national defense, that he wouldn't mess with that. In other words, many of the Federalists were afraid that, this navy that we've built up to defend ourselves against the French, that Jefferson is going to come in and demolish it. And for them, and Thomas Jefferson basically promises that he won't do that. And so with this promise, the Federalists kind of threw the support behind Thomas Jefferson, and eventually elect him president of the United States. Now, eventually, however, the issue regarding what was going on, with the elections, eventually convinces Congress to pass, and the states eventually ratify what is known as the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, which was actually ratified in 1804. Now, what this does really is that uh, essentially it kind of eliminates a whole awkward, first place gets president, second place gets vice president. Now the president has to select their vice president as their running mate. All right, so if you don't get enough electoral votes, if one candidate gets more electoral votes than the other, they become president, and the other candidate just loses. And so, again, this isn't, and it does a couple of other changes, which I'm not going to get into. But again, the important thing about this is that um, it really does kind of try to fix the issues of the elections at this point in time. Now, as I told you before, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams really didn't care for each other, at least politically speaking. John Adams kind of really hated the fact that he lost to Thomas Jefferson. But despite this, he nonetheless, presented himself at Jefferson's inauguration. He was there when Thomas Jefferson took the oath, and this is incredibly important in American history because this is the first true peaceful transfer of power in modern history. Before, yes, you've had power transfer from one person to another, but usually someone loses a head or something. In this case, the ex-president loses an election and graciously, hands power over to the other president, to his successor. So it's a very important kind of point in history. Now, Thomas Jefferson, even before he became president, finds himself facing crises here, especially regarding slavery. The first one is in 1800. In 1800, a slave named Gabriel Prosser leads a rebellion of slaves in Virginia. Basically, simultaneously, kind of he organizes and conspires with other slaves to simultaneously kill their masters, and they do. They eventually kind of kill a couple of masters, but before the rebellion is put down before it even gets anywhere. Prosser and 25 others were eventually executed, and that's it. But nonetheless, needless to say, slave revolts, if you all recall, is the number one fear of slave owners, especially in the South. So all of a sudden now this increases the paranoia. All of a sudden, how do we know that there's not any other slaves, conspiring against their masters? And so many slaves began passing, if you'll recall, many states had already passed pretty strict laws, managing slaves' lives, like what can they do in their free time, or can they purchase their freedom? And now they become even more stricter. Now, the other kind of major crisis that happens even before, even from the early 1790s is the Haitian Revolution. Now, Haiti is a French colony off of the coast. At the time, it's called Saint Domingue. Now, Saint Domingue is actually on the other side of an island of Hispaniola, sharing a border with Santo Domingo, which eventually becomes the Dominican Republic later on. But Saint Domingue is a French colony that produces sugar and tobacco, and it is probably the wealthiest colony in terms of its revenue in the Western Hemisphere. And it produces tons of sugar for the French. But needless to say, it is a slave society. 90% of the population is slaves, and the other 10% are either freed blacks or Europeans, whites. But eventually, because of the French Revolution back home, there is a question of freedoms and interpretations of what it means, and eventually slavery revolt breaks out. Well, here's the thing: it's kind of complicated. It's more than a slave revolt. It originally starts out as a rebellion of the freed blacks who felt that they should deserve the same rights and equality as the French back home. Uh, the French government was kind of hesitant to do that, but eventually they break out in violence. But eventually, the slaves themselves break out in violence and begin this revolution, or at least this rebellion against slavery. And eventually, again, over the next 15 years or so, the island goes back under French control. For a while, it's controlled by the British and eventually goes back to French control. But eventually, the slaves organize themselves in effective armies and declare themselves independent. So the colony of Saint Domingue eventually becomes the Republic of Haiti. Now, needless to say, the Haitian Revolution, I wish I could talk about it more just because it is so important. Remember, keep in mind that slavery is maybe one of the oldest institutions in human history. Slaves have been around since forever. And as far as we can tell, this is the first true successful slave revolt in history. All right, the slaves had declared themselves independent and had won their freedom, and it's a tremendous, achievement. But it's one that is marked by tragedy. All right, the Americans themselves don't recognize Haiti's independence well until after the Civil War. They actually purposely damaged the Haitian economy, hoping that the Haitian economy would collapse and eventually European power, particularly the French, would come in and reassert control. And a lot of this is driven by the southern states. Remember, the southern states themselves, majority, you have a significant slave population, and the last thing you want to see is a successful slave revolt. And so the American reaction to the Haitian Revolution was one of anger and resentment and fear. All right, fear that the ideas of slaves being able to overthrow their oppressors and win their freedom would eventually come to the United States. Now, if you recall that Alexander Hamilton's dream for the United States would be to essentially expand America's industrial power. The British themselves, I'm sorry, the British, Jefferson himself was a firm believer in the opposite of this. In other words, he believed that the future of the United States really does rest in agriculture. That the United States, should be an agrarian society. He envisioned a country where, you know, small landowners would, spread out throughout the United States and kind of, avoid government interference and just lead their lives. And, again, very different from what Alexander Hamilton had in mind. And so his vision of a limited government that doesn't impose its will on people and the people themselves are farmers, it's one that will kind of guide his presidency. Now, his presidency, at least early on, is marked by a battle with the judiciary system. Now, if y'all recall, the Constitution creates a judiciary system, but it does not very well define. It just creates the judiciary. And so in the 1790s, Congress passes a Judiciary Act and creates, the Supreme Court has already been created, but it also creates a series of district courts. It creates circuit courts. It creates appeals courts. And, so it's pretty much in place. Now, after Thomas Jefferson won the election and but before John Adams leaves office, the Federalist Congress passes what is known as the Judiciary Act of 1801. What this does is essentially expand the number of federal judges throughout the United States. And because it creates these new positions and these new seats, in the federal judiciary, John Adams, and the the Federalist Congress essentially fill these with diehard Federalists, those who share the opinions of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. I'm sorry, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, kind of essentially kind of making sure that the Federalists have these positions. Now, eventually, this increased power of the judiciary itself is one that is incredibly controversial. Now, eventually, the Judiciary Act itself will be repealed when Thomas Jefferson and the what becomes the Democrats take power in Congress after the transition. The Judiciary Act will be repealed, but nonetheless, you have a lot of federal judges now being Federalists, including one, John Marshall. John Marshall himself, considered to be one of the greatest Chief Justices, is a diehard Federalist. Now, nonetheless, you do have some very important kind of points and Supreme Court cases develop here at this point in time. The first one is of Marbury versus Madison. Now, uh, Marbury is a judge that was nominated by John Adams and appointed by or confirmed by Congress, and eventually he is assigned to the Western, or I'm sorry, the Eastern District of New York, and he goes there, and by law he has to present himself to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is basically the Secretary of State of the state, is supposed to basically confirm and sign off on his confirmation. The Secretary of State of New York at the time is James Madison, who, remember, is not a Federalist, far from it, and refuses to see him, saying, "You don't have the right to be here." Now, eventually, this case eventually goes all the way to Supreme Court. And this case, Marbury versus Madison, while it determines that Marbury doesn't have the right to be named as a federal judge, because if you recall, he was nominated under the Judiciary Act, which doesn't exist anymore. But more importantly, what it does is create this precedent of judicial review. In other words, the position or the role of the federal judiciary had always been kind of vague in the Constitution. It doesn't really say, yeah, it says, okay, we create a judiciary system, but what exactly does it do? Well, under this new theory, this new kind of judicial review, the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court now give themselves essentially the right to review cases regarding the constitutionality of federal cases. Now, it's not, again, mind you, this is only for federal cases. State cases are a state matter, but for federal cases, this is, this judicial review does apply. Now, in 1810, you have another case, Fletcher versus Peck. Now, what this essentially is that um, the state of Georgia had created a law essentially allowing it to basically seize territory from Native Americans and to sell it as private property. Now, remember, under the Constitution, the Native Americans are under the authority of the federal government, not the states. And so eventually, a lawsuit is brought in by Native Americans against the governor of Georgia, and eventually it is determined that yes, the law that Georgia had created, allowing them to sell Native American territory, is unconstitutional. So the reason why this case is so important is because for the first time in history, a a state law is considered unconstitutional under the United States Constitution. So it's a pretty important kind of hallmark in American history. Now, needless to say, because there are so many Federalists within the judiciary, and all of a sudden now they are endowed with this power of judicial review, you begin to see many of Thomas Jefferson and the Democrats' policies and laws basically being stricken down as unconstitutional. Now, it eventually gets to the point where one of the biggest kind of headaches for Thomas Jefferson and his Democrat Party was that of Samuel Chase. Samuel Chase is a Supreme Court justice, and he is probably one of the more staunch opponents of again, the Democrats in Thomas Jefferson's case. And so he eventually finds himself to be impeached. The Democrat-controlled Congress impeaches him. Now, remember, impeachment just means that a trial that under the Constitution, impeachment basically means that an individual within federal office has essentially committed high crimes or misdemeanors. This is what the Constitution says. Now, what that means, no one really knows. But nonetheless, the Democrat Congress makes the claim that Samuel Chase has committed high crimes and misdemeanors and impeaches him. Now, what this means is that there's a trial. Impeachment does not automatically assume guilt. For example, the previous president, Donald Trump, was impeached twice in his presidency, and both times he was found not guilty. So impeachment just merely means a trial. And so Samuel Chase was brought to trial, but the problem is that there are no high crimes or misdemeanors. His only crime really was disagreeing with Thomas Jefferson. And so the important thing about this, the reason why I bring this up, is because it establishes this precedent that just because you have a different political opinion from someone does not necessarily mean you're committing a crime, right? And this is kind of the main point of the impeachment of Samuel Chase. Now, in 1805, a opportunity presents itself that Thomas Jefferson cannot kind of deny. So if so kind of picking up from the French Revolution, if y'all recall, the monarchy is dissolved and there's a republic, but over the next 5 or 10 years, there is there's essentially a shift within French politics, where all of a sudden now people tired of Republican experiments, tired of these kind of high-minded ideals kind of not going anywhere, all of a sudden find themselves more and more under the control of a charismatic and successful general, Napoleon Bonaparte, eventually to the point where he is appointed first consul, which is a very the most high position in power for life, and eventually in 1805 will declare himself to be emperor. And so in 1805, Napoleon was hoping to basically recreate the French Empire in North America. Now, this land here you see here in green, after the American Revolution, was handed over to the Spanish. All right, so all of a sudden, this is now Spanish territory. However, in 1802, the French forced the Spanish to give them back this land. All right, so this is all technically now French territory. And his hope was to basically, again, recreate a French North America. However, with the Haitian Revolution and the success of the slave revolt there, all of a sudden now Napoleon really doesn't have any hope in doing anything with this land anymore. And so Thomas Jefferson sends a group of diplomats to Paris in the hopes of buying this territory here, particularly the city of New Orleans, for $10 million. Now, if you recall, or if you notice here on this map, the Mississippi River Valley, which includes everything from the Red River, Arkansas, the Platte River, Missouri, and specifically the Ohio River, all drains into the Mississippi River Basin, and it ends at the port of New Orleans. So all of a sudden now, this city controls all of the commerce in this region here. Because remember, like say for example in Ohio, you have grain farmers here in southwestern Ohio who actually will load their grain onto barges that float down the Ohio, eventually catch the Mississippi, and eventually make their way to wherever it is they're going. And so all of a sudden, Thomas Jefferson sees an opportunity here to take control of the city of New Orleans, right, and not have to worry about any type of possible, diplomatic crises with the French or the Spanish or anyone else. So he sends the diplomats to Paris with $10 million and tells them, see if Napoleon will sell you this. So when they meet with Napoleon, who, mind you, is still fighting these wars with these various countries of Europe and is in desperate need of cash, says, well, you add another $5 million and I will add all of French territory here, the area you see here in green. And so all of a sudden now, word gets back to Thomas Jefferson that he wants to buy the whole thing, and he says, absolutely. But here's where the problem is that the Constitution does not say anything about the acquisition and purchase of territory. Now, if you recall, remember, Thomas Jefferson prides himself to be a strict constitutionalist. He considers himself to be a strict interpretationalist. And so all of a sudden now he's giddy for this new land, even though technically speaking, it is unconstitutional. Nevertheless, again, people kind of, in times like these, you find that many people put their principles aside, and in this case, Thomas Jefferson and his party both basically throw their principles aside and sign off on this Louisiana purchase. And so, needless to say, it's a pretty big deal. The United States is now doubled in territory, and you have all of a sudden now this huge swath of land that now belongs to the United States. Now, the thing about it is that no one really knows what this land contains or what this land holds. And so Thomas Jefferson sends these two men, Lewis and Clark, and a couple of dozen other individuals to kind of search, and they record what they see. They find the various Native American tribes. They're led and guided by another Native American woman, Sacagawea. They record all the flora and fauna, plants and animals. And yeah, but again, all of a sudden now you begin to see this expansion westward. Now in 1804 there is yet another crisis that breaks out. In North Africa, there are a group of political entities known as the Barbary States. They are kingdoms, Muslim kingdoms in North Africa, and they make their living in a lot of ways by pirating. They seize vessels and they basically ask of tribute. In other words, they ask governments to basically pay them annually to leave them alone. And countries that don't pay, right, essentially find themselves subject to these pirate attacks. And so the United States, up until this point, had been paying the barbarian pirates, to avoid American vessels. But Thomas Jefferson stops that, and so eventually they begin seizing American vessels. And Thomas Jefferson eventually decides that enough is enough, and so he begins the process of actually sending the U.S. Navy to deal with these barbarian pirates. And it's a series of wars known as the Barbary Wars. But again, here's the thing: is that Thomas Jefferson had if y'all recall, Thomas Jefferson won the presidency the first time in 1800 by basically promising not to demilitarize, to keep the Navy as is and, just pay for it. But again, Thomas Jefferson broke his promise and demilitarized. Many of the naval vessels that the United States had built had been sold. And so, yeah. Nevertheless, you begin to see again Jefferson and Congress remilitarize, build more naval vessels, and eventually are successful. The Barbary pirates again eventually are forced to sign a treaty preventing them, or at least promising not to attack American vessels, and it's relatively successful. Now, if that wasn't enough, there's another crisis regarding Europe. So eventually the French, kind of back off from seizing American vessels, but now it's the British. The British are now not only seizing American vessels, they're actually impressing American sailors. Now, what this means is that British naval vessels will actually board American vessels, search the crew, and will begin, basically saying, well, this man used to serve in the British Navy and he abandoned us, so we're bringing him back. And so this process of basically just taking random sailors and forcing them into service is known as impressment. Now, it's not to say that there weren't, deserters, that there weren't British sailors who abandoned their post and eventually, found their way into an American crew. There were. I mean, there was plenty of them. But nonetheless, you do have instances where you just have American sailors being forced to serve in the British Navy. And so this issue of impressment becomes more and more concerning, and eventually Jefferson and Congress passed what is known as the Embargo Act of 1807. Now, by 1807, it's not just the British, but now the French who are both seizing random American vessels. And so the Americans passed the Embargo Act, essentially banning trade between them and both France and Britain. Now, it's not very clear at this point, this is a horrible idea because the United States is not the powerhouse economy that it is today. It's a middling power that is kind of getting on its feet, and we basically we need them more than they need us. And so with us banning America or banning trade with them, it's kind of, they just kind of shrug their shoulders and continue as business as usual. With us, it wrecks the economy, right? So it's passed in 1807 and is repealed in 1808 because it is a horrible idea. Now, in 1808, there was a new election. Uh, Thomas Jefferson, had been president for 2 years, and following the tradition of George Washington, choosing not to run again. And in this case, in 1808, his best friend James Madison eventually becomes president. Now, right before Madison becomes president, or Thomas Jefferson and Congress pass what is known as the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. What this does is essentially basically strike or tries to strike a deal between the British and the French. In other words, the Americans tell the British and the French, we promise to do business with whoever promises to stop seizing our vessels first. So whoever responds to this first, we'll do business with. And so Napoleon, wanting, doesn't really care either way, but hopes that it will at least somewhat hurt British, relations with the Americans, says, yeah, we'll stop seizing your vessels. And so all of a sudden now this pushes the Americans back onto the French side. And so the relationships between the Americans and the British continue to become more and more problematic. Now, not helping the situation is, this is obviously what, 30 plus years after the revolution. The original members of Congress and the Senate have pretty much all retired. They're dead or dying in many ways. And so this new generation of politicians comes in, and they hope to essentially kind of recreate the glory and the pride that their fathers had, in dealing with the British. And so you have these very pro-war, aggressive, for at least foreign policy speaking, um, politicians known as war hawks, who really keep beating the drums of war. Now, originally, they had been satisfied with just kind of, dealing with Native Americans in the West, pushing continue to push Native Americans, further and further westward. But with the Non-Intercourse Act and the British, basically, refusing to stop attacking American vessels, they begin banging the war drums to go to war with Britain. Now, originally, James Madison is able to avoid, doesn't want any issues, but with the American public, at least in many regards, wanting this war, especially in the South and in the West, you essentially have the United States officially declaring war in 1812. Now, the official cause of this war was the impressment of American sailors and the seizure of American vessels. Now, coincidentally enough, a month before the United States had declared war, the British had finally kind of said, you know what, yeah, we'll stop seeing your vessels, we'll stop impressing sailors, whatever. So this war didn't technically need to be fought. And it actually, quite frankly, is one of the dumbest wars ever in many ways. But nonetheless, we should probably talk about it. Now, here's the thing is that the United States, despite it being the one to declare war, is completely unprepared for this. First of all, if y'all recall the Bank of the United States, which was passed in 1781, it signed for a 20-year charter. So basically, Congress had to, Congress gave it 20 years, and in 20 years, it would basically be revisited again. So, it was passed in 1781, and so in 1811, it is up for consideration. Now, remember, at this point in time, Congress and the executive branch are both now controlled by Jeffersonians, by Democrats, and they are not big fans of the Bank of the United States. And so they basically let the charter expire. The Bank of the United States officially closes in 1811. Now remember, this kind of is not a good thing because aside from offering loans and credit, what it also does is provide a national currency system, and it also keeps basically the gold in reserve that it has, the United States has now, that no longer exists. So the central banking system, which is always helpful in a war, no longer exists in 1812. Number two, the war is supported by those in the South and the West, but here in the northeastern region, which has close economic and cultural ties with Britain, it's not really a thing. The United States, the northeastern part of the United States, does not support this war. Not only that, the Americans were hoping for a quick resolution because the British at this point in time are really still going at it with the French. And so they're hoping that with the French distracted in Europe, they'll be able to kind of win some quick victories. All right. And specifically when it comes to Canada, this is the other big goal of the United States is the invasion and acquisition of Canada from the British. This is what they're, what the Warhawks really have in mind. The problem is that a few months after the war ends, Napoleon is defeated. And all of a sudden now the full might of the British military now can turn its attention to the United States. So yeah, that kind of didn't work out like they'd hoped. Not only that, again, the United States simply does not have a military. Yes, it has a couple of naval vessels and they're very good, but compare that to the British Navy, they're not, it's not. The British Navy far outnumbers the American Navy, and even then, the United States Army does not really compete with the British military. So, all in all, really, really poor timing on the behalf of the Americans. Now, this inexperience and this lack of preparation and planning really does show itself, first of all, in the failed invasion of Canada. Most of this war will not be fought between the Americans and the British. In many ways, it's actually fought between the Americans and the Canadians. Now, if you remember, 50 during and after the American Revolution, 50,000 loyalists, who were living originally here in the 13 colonies, make their way into Canada. And so, they left angry and bitter and resentful over, the revolution. And so their children now are the ones fighting this war. They remember the bitterness and the anger of their parents, having to flee their homes, and they want revenge. And so not only does the American invasion fail, you begin to see British Canadian soldiers begin actually attacking American settlements here on the frontier. Now, there are some successes. The U.S. Navy does win some minor engagements with the British. Like I said, the U.S. Navy is small, but they're very well trained and they're very well led. In addition, many of the Western Native American tribes had joined the war on the side of the British. The British had promised them that they would help, force the Americans into conceding land and stopping American settlers from moving into their traditional territory. And so many of the Native American tribes here of the Old Northwest joined with the side of the British. All right. Now, despite this, the U.S. Army is able to win successful victories, all right, in this region. Now, um, in 1814, a British fleet arrives out of nowhere off of the coast of Washington, D.C. All right, the American army defending there is completely caught off guard, and eventually they're defeated, and Washington, D.C. is burnt to the ground by the British. You remember the capital is still technically under construction and now has been destroyed by the British. The British get back on their ships and sail northwards to the city of Baltimore in Maryland. And again, despite a large number of vessels, the British cannot destroy and cannot get past the fort defending Baltimore, Fort McHenry. Now, just as an aside, that battle between the British Navy and Fort McHenry, where the British vessels are bombing Fort McHenry, hoping to get past it to attack the city of Baltimore, a American prisoner who the British captured in Washington, a doctor named Francis Scott Key, along with his father and Francis Scott Key's slave, eventually kind of see the bombardment of Fort McHenry, and notice that the fort is still standing, and the American flag flying over it is still waving, and eventually writes a poem about this, which eventually becomes obviously the Star Spangled Banner. Now, um, despite the British victories of this war, really, quite frankly, the British were never really that interested in fighting this war. They see it as pointless, and they really have no interest in continuing this war. And so there are negotiations of going on to finally end this war. Now, in 1815, January 1815, a British army lands off the coast of New Orleans and tries to attack the city head on. However, the defense of the city, led by a man named General Andrew Jackson, who will become important later on, eventually is able to win a stunning victory against the British in the Battle of New Orleans. Now, FYI, the the Americans kind of knew this battle was coming, and so the Americans had begun basically recruiting everyone from convicts to slaves, and even a pirate crew. Pirates are still operating in the Caribbean, a small number, but nonetheless, basically hired them as mercenaries to defend the city of New Orleans, and it is successful, right? But coincidentally enough, the biggest victory of the war in terms of the American side is fought after the war technically ends. The Americans and the British signed the Treaty of Ghent. Ghent is a town in Belgium where the treaty was kind of hammered out and signed, and this officially ends the war. So the Battle of New Orleans, basically, which is again fought a month after the war technically ended. Remember, this is before the era of Twitter or social media or text messaging, so it does take a bit for news to travel across the Atlantic. Now, here's the thing: is that um, while this war technically is a tie, nothing really comes out of it. The Americans and the British agreed to kind of resume trade, and everything goes back to the way it was. It really is considered to be a huge victory for the Americans. All right, I mean, if you think about it, it's like the UTEP football team. For those of you who are familiar with college football, tying, not necessarily beating, but tying the University of Alabama. It's a big deal, and so the Americans are also filled with pride. They went toe to toe with the world's greatest superpower and didn't lose, which to them is a win. And the many Americans see it that way. In addition, the American government never really wavered. So in many aspects of history, in many instances like this, where you actually have a representative government, whether it's a democracy or a republic, in many times of crises, these Republican or Democratic governments basically cave to authoritarians. In other words, trying to win a war via committee, via legislation, is very difficult to do. And so many, Republican governments in the past will essentially, kind of pause and suspend itself and basically give itself to military dictatorship. And the United States doesn't do that. Congress remains in session even though Washington is burned to the ground. Everything, the Constitution itself holds firm. And so this strengthening of institutions really does give a lot of, hope to the Americans that we've got a good thing going. Um, and even then, this area of the Northwest, even after the American Revolution, you still have British soldiers operating in this area. You still have British forts, and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that the Treaty of Ghent does is basically recognize the United States. This is their territory, and the British eventually agree to leave. And so all of a sudden now, you don't have to worry about the British, or you don't have to, the Native Americans are still problematic, but now, they are the true source of political power here in the Northwest Territories. Now, despite the fact that Canada, fought this war on the side of the British, they nonetheless kind of pride themselves in the fact that they defended their homeland, that they defended against an invading army and won some pretty significant battles. And so this confidence of the Canadians to basically run themselves and manage themselves will eventually lead to not necessarily independence, but basically autonomy. In other words, they're still part of the British Empire. Even today, they're still technically part of the British Empire. They are, and just in name only, but in reality, Canada is independent. And so this autonomy, this self governance, which begins in 1840, all right, kind of has its origins here in this War of 1812. Now, the other big kind of thing that happens during this period in time is the pretty much the beginning and the end of the Federalist Party. Now, if you all recall, the Federalist Party up until from the birth of the Republic, throughout the next couple of years, was the dominant political party because of George Washington. However, if you recall, remember, most of its power comes from here in the Northeast. And during the war, the merchants of Boston and New York and these other areas here in the Northeast not only didn't really want to cooperate with the American government, many of them continued to do business with the British. So all of a sudden now there's a question of loyalty and treason, et cetera, et cetera. And even then, there were the biggest, their representatives in Congress were the biggest callers of peace. Let us end this war. Let's get the British whatever they want. Let's just, go back to business. And so the Federalists, trying to kind of reconfigure a strategy, trying to come up with a something, a plan moving forward, all right, come together at the city of Hartford in Connecticut in 1814, and trying to find a way to kind of effectively, you know, uh, 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 combat the Democrats and James Madison, politically speaking. Now, a lot of journalists travel to Hartford to cover this convention, and a small but very vocal group of Federalists, frustrated at the lack of peace and the continuation of the war, begin openly talking about secession. Remember, secession is basically leaving the Union, so they're actually actively saying, "Well, if the United States doesn't want to negotiate with us, then let's just form our own country." Now, this again, it's a very small group. I want to say like three or four people, and they were quickly shouted down, and they were actually kind of kicked out of the convention. But the journalists who were covering this reported this as like, wait a second, all of a sudden now there's talk of secession in this convention. And so this news comes out just as the Americans had, ended this war, and as far as they're concerned, had won this war. And all of a sudden now the Federalists seem like traitors, anti-American. And so this will really mark the end of the Federalists as an effective political party. They'll continue on for the next 25 or so odd years, but yeah, it's done. All right, the Federalists really, are dead as a political party from this point on. All right, you all. So again, as a reminder, your next exam is scheduled for this coming Friday. It will. The study guide has been posted. All right. Remember, it'll cover the last couple of chapters, but please be aware that the next exam is at 9 a.m. or will open early Friday morning and will close at 9 p.m. on Sunday. So please make sure you have that done before then. I'm sorry that we have to do this virtually. I'd rather much have done this in person, but it is what it is. But nonetheless, I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week, and we'll just go from there. Thank you all.